Hello, and thank you for attending today's webinar. We will begin the presentation in approximately 1 minute. All right, let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the webinar about how T-Mobile is transforming its business with GitLab on its DevOps journey. My name is Aditya Mupavarapu. I'm the global segment lead for DevOps on Amazon Web Services, and I will be your host and moderator for today's presentation. From the GoToWebinar control panel, you will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the question panel. We will collect the questions and address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Also, at the end of the event is a brief survey. Please stay connected until the end of the broadcast and submit your feedback as your opinions count. Lastly, the PowerPoint presentation will be available through SlideShare and the recording of the webinar on YouTube via an email that will be sent about 2 to 3 days after the conclusion of the event. So keep an eye out for the follow-up email sent to the address you provided. Again, welcome to today's live webinar about how T-Mobile is transforming its business with GitLab on its DevOps journey. Today, you will learn about T-Mobile and GitLab empowering developers together, GitLab, the imperative to move faster, and DevOps on Amazon Web Services. Once again, my name is Aditya Mupavarapu. I'm the global segment lead for DevOps on AWS Partner Network. I will be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Also with me is Chris Hill as a senior manager, developer platforms at T-Mobile, and Pete Goldberg, director of partnerships at GitLab. Before we get started, quick reminder to please post your questions in the questions box throughout the presentation, and we will review them at the end of today's event. So let's begin. Chris? Unmute.
Can you guys hear me now? We good? Excellent. Thanks, Aditya. Sorry about that. Thanks to everyone who's joined us from their home office. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Chris Hill. I'm the Senior Manager of Developer Platforms at T-Mobile. I think I'm also here from my home office. I also have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old who may potentially become temporary co-presenters. Just a fair warning for everyone, I don't have a lock on my office. But today we're going to go over some of my favorite content around forward-looking software engineering within the larger enterprise in the context of T-Mobile. The reason I've kind of titled this Chasing Unicorns at T-Mobile is there are unicorns within the industry that are pushing the DevOps paradigm and pushing the increased throughput paradigm and high-performing teams that are mostly in the FANG sort of realm, right? The Facebook, Amazon's, Microsoft. It has been an objective of ours at T-Mobile, but also other large enterprises that I've been a part of, to move closer to that unicorn standard. There's no reason why other companies can't reach the same level of expertise when it comes to delivering software engineering. To give you a little bit of background on myself, this is my 4th large enterprise digital transformation, and also my fourth industry. So semiconductors was where I started, then I moved into retail, then I went into automotive, and now it's telecom. And what I've noticed that is similar across all of these industries is the desire for the increase in delivery and developer productivity and throughput. And part of that comes from some things that you may not think about immediately, things like developer experience, things like tool chain throughput, context switching, and stuff like that. We're going to go over those concepts today, and we're also going to go over in the scope of T-Mobile on how we approach that. So the agenda today will be, I'll start with how enterprise delivery presents itself as a challenge to most larger enterprises, how developer platforms are challenging in themselves. I'll also talk about the continuous delivery platform, which is essentially my organization within T-Mobile, and a little bit about how we conduct ourselves, as well as how we execute in terms of platform performance for the rest of the developers within T-Mobile. And then we'll talk a little bit about our partners who are on the call with us today. And then I'll ask at the end kind of where we need help, and then I will pass off to the other speakers. So I'm going to start today with enterprise delivery challenges. Usually within larger enterprises, you have a set of standards and processes that may not be centralized and that may be more fragmented. One of the challenging parts at T-Mobile is that each team is leveraging a tool differently. There may be a pocket of teams that use a tool to its fullest. There may be a pocket of teams that don't. What also comes with that same variability in using the tools is a lost relativity of your work units. One team may determine that a story or a bug classifies as one thing and an epic classifies as one thing. The other team could think of it as something completely different. And that poses a lot of data integrity challenges. That poses a significant increased cost in operation from a support vector perspective. And the maturity variability creates this, how do you measure quality when you have teams that are just starting out on maybe their transformation journey versus teams that are high performing and is significantly further along. Part of the fragmented tool chains and part of the inconsistent usage of tools is also weighed down by legacy debt. I know it sounds really nice when you can present an idea where everyone should follow the same guidelines or the same standard, but when you have a set of legacy deprecation debt that remains extremely high, then your priorities always constantly shift to firefighting the legacy so that you can build on something new, and you're in this constant state of flux. What also happens is current tools can't be fully integrated with each other because they have different narratives and different sort of paradigms with how they were built. Some were structured for fragmentation, some were structured not for fragmentation. I'm going to go a little bit more into that later on in this presentation as well. Now, developer platforms is an area that I'm highly passionate about. And I feel that if you are going to create a platform in your industry, then you need to empower your users rather than impede your users. And developer platforms, you could either be doing one or the other. Either you're getting in the way of everybody, or you're actually empowering them to excel or mature or keep the marketability and industry standard for your enterprise. I like to describe developer platforms as the systems that are involved between idea and production. So every change that goes through your software development lifecycle most likely touches one or more of these systems on its sort of path to production. We call this developer platforms within T-Mobile. One of the interesting things based off of either you're empowering or impeding, most platforms I see start at empowerment. They're very loose, there's no compliance, there's no governance, there might not be as much scale, and it's highly relevant for the industry standard. So it starts out and you're moving very quickly. And then all of a sudden, when you get the sheer numbers of the enterprise and you start putting on all of those items, you slowly start to dwindle your relevance. You slowly start to put on more compliance, which doesn't allow as much experimentation. And you eventually move in the opposite direction that you initially set out to do, and that was of higher throughput. Now, this idea of creating a platform within the enterprise, you have to strike a balance on both sides. There are enterprise needs that are definitely reasonable. There are also user needs that are reasonable as well. And what you want to create is something that doesn't get worked around a lot, but also meets the needs of the enterprise. So what I'd like to do is walk you through a little bit of how the developer platforms organization works at T-Mobile. Part of, actually really quick, part of the challenge within developer platforms is some of the byproducts and the impacts of everything that I just mentioned prior. If you have different pipeline strategies or an inconsistent dev process or developer standards that are different amongst the maturity levels of all your teams and maybe even multiple platforms, what you get is this sort of high cost of ownership. There's no real shared ecosystem. And those support vectors that I mentioned earlier become extremely hard to support something that has so many permutations or variability. And ultimately, what comes with your loss in speed and your efficiencies comes a very poor developer experience. I think all of us know in the back of our minds that happier developers build quality software. Well, what are the incremental improvements we can do to make happy developers? Do we even measure to understand whether our developers within our value stream are happy or not? Do we know the average lead time across all of our value streams? Do we see a shorter lead time for happier developers versus a longer lead time for unhappier developers? There's also a limited visibility and metrics to what's happening in your business. One of the big challenges I saw initially with some of the fragmentation is we couldn't tell whether or not we are improving over time, and we couldn't answer the question as to are your developers productive? Sometimes that answer became, well, we had more features this month than we did last month, and more features this quarter than we did the quarter before, which is really more of a naive indicator and not as focused relative to overall throughput. Our internal developer platform organization is called CDP. It's called Continuous Delivery Platform. And our vision statement is essentially empowering T-Mobile developers to build better software, faster, safer, healthier. The better aspect of this is higher quality, faster is higher throughput, safer is we want to make sure and left shift security. And we also want to make it a healthy experience. We don't want it to be frustrating in nature. We want it to be intuitive. There are a couple of principles that we follow when we want to build a platform within T-Mobile, specifically when we wanted to build the developer platform within T-Mobile, that we're following and that we've grounded ourselves on a regular basis. This is the wheel that I'm going to just start at 12 o'clock here, and then I'll slowly go clockwise here. So we like the idea of collective ownership. We'd like it's not a platform team versus a product team, or an app team versus a product team, or an operations team. We like the ownership that there is a developer community within our enterprise that maintains a community of practice and ownership of all of our standards. Our standards isn't one team standards. Our standard is our enterprise's standards. One thing that we mention here on our principles is the idea of self-service. Self-service to me has two different interpretations. One self-service could be, well, can the person initiate their request on their own? Well, that answer may be true, but if I have to initiate a request and then I have to dig through an approval chain and I have to go chase down the first approver, next approver, next approver, and then chase down the implementer to get my thing done, or take somebody out to lunch to get it to happen, it's almost like I'm hand carrying the request And that just introduces a lot of friction to make what seems like very small level of process should exist between getting you what you need. So there's self-service in terms of, yes, I did it all by myself, but then there's self-service that just automatically says, hey, you know what? You belong in this group. We're going to give you a default permission set. You know what? You're automatically ramped. Here's the access that you need. And it was done proactively. And that just means you needed to go, hey, I wanted to sign up. It happens instantaneously. That's my idea of self-service, not getting lost in an enterprise ticketing system or multiple ticketing systems. Another principle we have is we want to make it difficult to do the wrong thing. There are guardrails for a reason, and we want to make sure that blast radius are very minimal and that we've architected for safety. So this kind of goes along the lines, I'm going to jump ahead real quick, to continuous experimentation. We want to be able to foster the experimentation to remain relevant and industry current, but we also want to make your experiments happen in a bubble so that you don't impact everyone else. We want to give you the same realistic or representative results as if it was already in production, right? Another sort of parallel to continuous experimentation is the idea of continuous improvement. We always want to adhere to supporting feedback, and incoming feedback is the only way that we improve over time. But we like to take incremental steps to ensure that we're improving over time. And we end up capturing things from our own productivity, like developer happiness, like onboarding happiness, migration happiness. And we ensure that we're meeting the needs of all of our customers on a regular basis, be it surveys or capturing the analytics on their workflow, et cetera. The last item I had here on this transparency was transparency. And we follow this principle where we want to ensure that everything we do happens in the open, and we want to make sure that our poor performing sprints show in the open and our good performing sprints. And we also want to ensure that we're getting votes and we're getting opinions from the enterprise development community as to whether or not we should go in a direction or not go in a direction. That's part of our roadmap. It needs to be this organic roadmap that comes from the bottom up. But we also need to be very clear in the fact that, well, sometimes we hit debt sprints and we go, you know what, feature development is on pause. Now we're only going to work on debt, for example. There are also some ways of working and working methods that we adhere to on a regular basis that are grounded by the principles I just mentioned on the wheel, but these are more tactical. We like the concept and the philosophy of asynchronous communication. If you can articulate your problem statement in writing, maybe you need to think about it a little bit more. We really like to have very clear, distinct English words on what's actually the problem statement, rather than forcing a synchronous meeting on everyone when we don't fully understand the problem statement yet. We like to ensure that we can remain flexible where people are located and do remote by default. We also adhere to the principle of inner source. Everyone can look at everyone else's source code. I know some enterprises have large walls between individual pockets of source code, and the amount of dependency chains and tax that puts on your workflow when teams have to work together is just additional barriers. We also heavily subscribe to the SRE manifesto, in that we're doing postmortem sessions that are blameless and they reflect on the unplanned incidents, and we make sure we get a return on the unplanned incidents. We also focus a lot on core versus context. If what we're doing could be done better by a third party and can still meet our needs, then we call it context. If something is important to how T-Mobile conducts that part of business, or has a specific T-Mobile flavor that's unique to our business and what makes us special, then we consider that core. We follow the principle of small batches as well, small incremental changes that deliver maximum value. We think this is really important because then we have consistent feedback loops and come back very quick before we make mistakes. And we feel that the products all should mature with automation. The days where there's one isolated team that works on automation and operations, and then there's an isolated team that works on just the product, and you have this wall throwing are over. And the unicorns have adjusted to this a while ago, but product teams should run and operate. Part of measuring developer productivity, at least within developer platforms, follow along with the accelerate metrics. And those are, Dr. Nicole Forsgren has a book, Accelerate Out, where she mentions these key metrics that aren't as much of a focus on proxy metrics as much as they are on key productivity metrics: deployment frequency, lead time for changes, MTTR, change failure rate relative to customer base, and then also eNPS from a happiness perspective. We like to ensure that flow remains our key priority, and we'd like to make sure that throughput remains on everyone's mind. If you can keep a high deployment frequency and you can maintain the ability to change and pivot more rapid, then you will be able to adjust your business faster in terms of if you had a new market demand that came and you don't have experience in that area, you should be able to change and pivot your software rapidly to adjust to make your company more competitive. I mean, I think this really makes a difference in terms of you architect for speed, you don't architect for cost, and you don't architect for quality as the number one. Your speed will eventually outweigh and allow you to pivot faster. If quality is something you need to focus on, well, surprise, you have very rapid software development lifecycle and a low lead time, you can improve that very quickly. If it's a different market or a different industry that you want to get involved in, you should be able to do the same thing. I wanted to touch a little bit more on the evolution of CDP within T-Mobile. And CDP, again, stands for Continuous Delivery Platform. And the evolution that we had from a toolchain perspective follows the flow you see on your screen from left to right. And from a CI/CD perspective, I consider this probably the core of developer platforms, is your orchestrator on how you would ensure that everything is running in a continuous integration, continuous delivery type of fashion. And what I've done here is I've outlined on the left essentially a generic CI/CD flow with a bunch of actors: an initiator, an orchestrator, a counselor, some deployment endpoints, some receptacles, and observers. These are just English words to kind of describe the systems that are associated with developer platforms. What you'll notice on our legacy implementation is we're predominantly focused on a fragmented tool set, which means different companies have different narratives and different intents with their roadmap on where they want to go. But it's almost like they all fit in place to be able to piecemeal together your tool chain. One of the high costs of this is in the aspect of context switching. When you have to move from tool to tool in order to create your overall throughput, you've got a high degree of Conway's law, which Conway's law, if you look it up, it's essentially your software architecture or your flow architecture will equate to your organization structure over time. If you're having to jump into a source control management tool and you have to open up another tab or another browser to log into your orchestrator tool, you have just paid a context switch penalty. Both tools have different narratives, different roadmaps, and different sort of life cycles. One of the underpinnings of the major change that we made in our evolution, along with all of those principles I mentioned before, is moving to GitLab. And what GitLab figured out earlier on was a combination of all of the systems without any context switch to the developers. Things like source control management and CI/CD was, I think, their initial bread and butter there. Now they're eliminating the context switch from an artifact repository perspective, eliminating the context switch from a security perspective. And what they've allowed us to do is eliminate some of those friction zones to make it fit in place, but to put throughput as the number one priority. So what we are planning to do the rest of 2020 is continue to transition all of our development products to CDP, which is backed by GitLab, and we'd like to retire our legacy platform in favor of the throughput. And we'd like to upskill the entire community, and this is the enterprise development community, all at the same time without having to go and change a bunch of legacy platforms all simultaneously that all have their own different life cycles. One thing that I wanted to that I mentioned earlier was about core versus context, and this was really about, can T-Mobile run something better than a company should be able to run it? And one of the things we chose to do was using GitLab.com. GitLab.com is GitLab's SaaS model. And we asked ourselves the question, could T-Mobile run GitLab better than GitLab can run GitLab? And no one answered yes to that question. GitLab should be able to run their product better than anyone else can. But by leveraging the SaaS model, T-Mobile can now focus on what makes T-Mobile special and what implementation of GitLab will make T-Mobile the most successful. I just mentioned a couple of items here that we tend to focus on now that we're not focusing on supporting the GitLab SaaS or the GitLab infrastructure. Things like integrations with T-Mobile internal tools, things like running runners within the T-Mobile environment, any sort of automation templates and reusability, any sort of SOX controls, all the digital assets that exist within the integrations with the other T-Mobile systems. Those are what makes T-Mobile's implementation of GitLab special. The running of GitLab infrastructure isn't included in that list. So we ask ourselves this question a lot, and there are other aspects of this as well outside of GitLab that it makes sense for another company to manage it. What I also want to show is GitLab's maturity model, because I really like it and I use it a lot internally within T-Mobile, and it basically meets the same sort of transparency standard and pillar that we had within our development platform foundation. And this essentially exposes GitLab's interpretation of their maturity of all the products that they currently have right now. If you notice these little icons, you'll see, oops, sorry about that, you will see the heart shows up when they feel that it's an experience or it's a feature that customers love. If, as you start to dwindle on these circles, you'll see that this may be an experience where customers don't really love it yet. In fact, GitLab doesn't really love it yet, and they know it's not perfect, but it's iterating to get better over time and waiting to see kind of what sticks. I think this exemplifies the transparency that GitLab provides, but also makes it very clear to their customers that we know we're not the best in this area. This is what we feel like we are really good at. This is where we can compete at. Let us know and partner with us to make the better areas better over time, to make the worse areas better over time. One of the things I also noticed is that what the partnership feels like is more of T-Mobile working in tandem with GitLab to make a better product and leverage GitLab's product lifecycle to make higher throughput for T-Mobile in the longer term. There's one last announcement that I'm sure you guys are all aware of. We just merged with Sprint, and we wanted to welcome all Sprint, but what this also means is it welcomes a lot of opportunity, and we are joined together with Sprint to transform an industry of how telecom should be done. And there's plenty of opportunity. We're still looking for help from a software engineering perspective. We're still looking for help on transforming how developer platforms work within T-Mobile, but then software engineering itself within T-Mobile. So with that, I would like to pass over to Pete from GitLab. Thanks everyone for your time.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate you sharing your guys' journey and your story, and we're super excited to be a part of it. I'm Pete Goldberg. I manage our partnerships from GitLab's perspective, and super excited to be here to talk to you a little bit more about what GitLab does. So a lot of what Chris talked about was really about the things that we really focus on how we help customers and the tools that the things that you need for a digital transformation. And really what we're focusing on as GitLab as a company is providing our users and our customers a way to increase operational efficiencies, to deliver better products faster, and do so by providing them in a much more secure and compliant way. And that's really the mission of what we're trying to do within our product. And Chris kind of outlined what I wanted to take a step back and talk about a little bit. We've seen enterprises like T-Mobile and the industry as a whole spend a ton of money, almost $4 billion. And I think this data came from IDC in 2017. I think even the number's probably even higher as time moves on. But almost 90% of those enterprises are saying they're not happy with the results they're getting. And the main problem that they have is that they're spending, almost half of them are saying they're wasting time making these tools work together in the repeatable tasks. And really it's what Chris was talking about around the context switching, right? There's a lot of great tools out there, but it's really about like, how do you make everything work together? And one of the things that I think of and kind of where GitLab comes together is there was a time before 2007 where we all carried a phone and a day timer, checked our email on our laptop, I had a camera, and I did all these different things, and I had all these different tools to do them, and I didn't do it really efficiently. And then magically in 2007, Apple came out with the smartphone, right? And all of a sudden, all these things I don't need anymore. When was the last time I took my camera out of the bag and carried it? I use my iPhone, I take a picture, my calendar, everything is there. And what it did is it enabled me to have access to new things like social media, e-commerce, and alerts, because everything's in a single intuitive user experience based on a single data model, and the integrations are all there. And now I carry one device and it makes my life way easier. If you think about that with the DevOps toolchain, that's what GitLab's doing. We're becoming that single intuitive user experience for all of those different point tools. So now you have the ability to do project management, source code management, CI/CD, issue tracking, logging, like all of those things in the same platform, all of your teams across the entire organization. And so now you can do concurrent development. People are working together faster versus being in parallel. You can bring security closer to when you're writing the code, which makes it cheaper to resolve because you're identifying it easier before it gets into production. Collaboration increases, and we can help measure cycle time, which now increases. And again, the whole idea is that we're bringing it all together. And that really is mostly because you think about that we're putting everything in a single data store. So when we look across the DevOps toolchain, we see it really breaking down into 10 different categories. And Chris drilled into this a little bit about the things we're best at, or we think, and the analysts have told us we're great at, and the things that we're iterating quickly to try to always be improving the product and being super transparent about that with our customers, our prospective customers, our community of open source users, where we're looking at how we can do that better. But because we're delivering it as a single application, importantly to you, you have a single data store, you have a single permission model. Your governance and security is all tied together, and your team works together. And what that allows you to do is take away the context switching tax and move quicker. So if we break that down and we think about the developer workflows and like what Chris is trying to create with his organization at T-Mobile, when you think about it from a developer's perspective, your entire team's working together and using, you can start with our opinionated workflow, which is this, or you can very quickly modify it, based on some simple YAML files. But think about someone in the business coming and creating an issue and saying, I have a problem with this app, or I want to make this small change. Your developer is going to see that issue. They're going to make code changes, create a merge request, and commit that code, which then is going to kick off the CI pipelines for us. So we're going to run through all of our tests. And then continual automated process, when that testing finishes, all the stakeholders can look in the reviewer app and see what that looks like. So maybe I'm doing a button movement on a screen or a change, and people want to actually test it versus depending on automated testing to make sure the functionality is there, but just want to actually see it. We can do that. We can allow more collaboration and discussion. And when we're ready to approve it, we can push that downstream, and the CD pipelines, run again, where we're able to deploy to any of the flavor that you feel of compute within AWS that you feel is the right one for that workload. And where this becomes really important to you as an organization is you can start looking at the different types of compute and saying, which one of these best supports this application for our business versus which one's easiest to do as a technology. And you can start looking at, how do I leverage the right types of compute for this workload? And again, this is adding automation, increasing collaboration for your team, and that's kind of what we're referring to with the concurrent development workflow. Now, we see customers adopt the journey at different places. Again, Chris broke out where we're lovable and maybe some places we're not. But when you look at our portfolio and how the product, and we take you through that journey, most of our customers will start with things like source code management and CI/CD. They may start with our security, they may not. They may have other tools that they're feeling great. But one of the things that we've tried to really do with GitLab is we have our opinionated view of how to do it, but we're also very open, and we allow you to plug and play things in. So if there are other tools in that tool chain that work really well for you and you're not ready to move on, it's very easy to do those types of integration. And we try to make that, again, increase the value that you're getting out of our tool. So a little bit more about how we achieve things as a company. If you're not really familiar with GitLab, we are built on open source. We truly believe in our community. Our community is a huge, impactful way of how we've grown and iterated so fast. Today, there's over 100,000 organizations that are using GitLab. Based on a company of about 1,200 all remote people. We were actually kind of in a good place when everybody started working from home, at least from a process perspective. But we also believe everyone can contribute. And so when we may have 1,200 employees, we have another 2,200 plus people and organizations that contribute regularly to our product, which makes it better for everyone. And we also roll this out quickly. We innovate and release once a month. We've done that on the 22nd now, every single month without missing. So every month we're seeing customers adopt. We see most of our customers being within 3 minor releases of the most current version, which is unheard of. But it's a reflection of people seeing the value and understanding of what we can do and how that helps them if they want to keep current. And then again, we're a huge believer in open source. We contribute heavily to it as our tool, and we try to leverage other technologies in that are based on it and contribute back out to those projects. My slides aren't changing. And so I'd love to turn it over to Aditya, talk a little bit about the AWS perspective on this. And Aditya.
Thank you, Pete. So thank you, Chris and Pete. It was very insightful and also humbling to hear how partners like GitLab are building solutions on top of AWS as a platform and helping customers focus on core versus context, like Chris mentioned. I want to talk a little bit about DevOps and Agile. The expected outcome from these processes or tool chain implementations is the ability to deliver business value faster. Don't create another silo, call it DevOps team. Don't try to work on it like it's a project. It's fundamentally changing how you deliver software by changing your culture, processes, and using the right tooling to get the job done. In order to achieve that level of agility, we need to allow teams to experiment quickly, expose new features to maybe a limited set of users or limited set of systems, and hence significantly controlling the impact radius. And also make sure you have necessary mechanisms in place to analyze customer feedback as they use these features. And lastly, use that feedback to inspire new ideas and deliver more business value. A little fun fact here, about 75% of features and services developed by AWS come directly from customer feedback or requests. So the goal here is to keep the innovation flywheel spinning as fast as possible. Next slide, please. So in order to keep up with the pace of innovation, software system architectures are also evolving, and we hear that a lot from our customers every day. If you look at a monolithic application, it tries to do everything, and all the services are tightly coupled. And you often have a shared and complex release process. And if you were to introduce a change, you end up having to rebuild, recompile, repackage, which could take hours. And if everything goes fine, you end up having to re-trigger your functional test suites. And if that goes fine, you have to juggle with this complex operation of coordinating a release activity. Often teams are organized in silos when you're looking at a monolithic application by their functions. Like you have a QA team, you have a security team, you have a performance team, and there's a lot of ticketing, waiting on each other, and handoffs, which everything adds up to time and cost of delivering the feature. This leads to fragile software that is very rigid to scale, and we often end up having to over provision, preparing for the peak loads or user activity. And this in turn makes it very hard to adopt new technologies, right? So the evolution normally centers around migrating or decoupling the monolith into smaller services or microservices that focus on doing one thing, and each microservice does it really well. And because of you're able to decouple them, each microservice also often comes with its own data source, which makes it easy to deploy and scale independently. And you end up with the ability to make decisions really quickly based on, because the decisions only impact an individual service. So the radius of impact is very low and controlled. So you need to focus on rapid incremental innovation versus taking one giant leap. So I want to talk about three areas here that help you with modern application development. One is architectural patterns. So that talks about are you implementing microservices properly? And we'll talk about operational models. Are you managing and scaling servers yourself, or are you focusing on building business value? Again, core versus context theme here. And finally, we'll talk about software delivery patterns. How quickly are you able to release? And I see this sometimes where customers think they implemented very strong DevOps. And when we ask some questions about how often do you release, the answers are sometimes quarterly or monthly. That kind of defeats the purpose. You want to be able to iteratively deliver business value. So the software delivery process also needs to be improved. And here, so we'll talk about microservice architecture. Each service exposes an application programming interface or API, and all collaborating services communicate via the API, and all services communicate via network calls. This helps avoid tight coupling and enforces strict separation. And with each service decoupled, you have the autonomy and flexibility to deploy and scale each service independently. And also, each service needs to maintain a strict API contract and avoid any breaking changes. The APIs are your commitment to your organization, and we need to maintain it. And if you're familiar with AWS, I'm sure you heard us talk about the shared responsibility model. This means AWS is responsible for certain parts of the system, and the customer is responsible for certain parts. All in all, AWS is responsible for security off the cloud, and customers are responsible for security in the cloud. And if you look at this spectrum from left to right, on the rightmost side, the customer is responsible for fewer things, and AWS does a lot more of the heavy lifting. And on the contrary, if you look at the leftmost side of the spectrum here, the customer has to do way more heavy lifting and AWS is responsible for fewer things. So customers on the rightmost side, customers can focus on application code, security, and network configuration. And AWS will take ownership of instance scaling, some management tasks, provisioning, patching your servers, along with the physical hardware, network, and the facilities itself. So we're always thinking about how do we continue to further evolve so that we reduce that undifferentiated heavy lifting for the customers, so they can focus on business problems and not worry about infrastructure and data centers. Next, please. And lastly, I want to talk about delivery patterns. If you're operating in a monolithic model, everything is tightly coupled. All the teams in the developer section, they're working on one service, which is the monolith. And there's often a single delivery pipeline. Anytime a change is introduced, it goes through one pipeline where you build, test, and deploy. And when you look at microservices and how that changes your delivery, it's not only about breaking down the application into smaller manageable services or microservices. It also is about reorganizing the teams, and developers now form smaller groups, and each group is responsible for their own service or business area. At Amazon, we call it the two-pizza team. And two-pizza team is, they own everything. They have the autonomy to make decisions. They own all the way from building to security to compliance to monitoring and operations, you name it. So that way, now you have multiple streams of delivery pipelines, and teams are quickly delivering business value. And lastly, I want to share a little fun fact. At Amazon, we have thousands of such two-pizza teams building tens of thousands of services every day, deploying to multiple environments. And as of the 2019, the most recent number I have is that we do 190 million deployments a year. With that, we'll move to a Q&A session. Let's look at some questions here. How does T-Mobile manage large-scale adoption of new tool sets? Chris?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think any sort of adoption that you're going to promote in an enterprise should have some level of organic growth, and should actually be attracting that sort of technical base. If it's not attracting that technical base, maybe the journey of adoption isn't actually going in the right path. But I've seen two different sides of this. I've seen one side where adoption is done via leadership saying, you absolutely have to do this, and if you don't do this, then you don't have a job here anymore. I've also seen the approach where you're constantly in analysis paralysis because you can't get a collective majority on what's best for your enterprise. I think one of the best ways to create adoption, one of the best ways within T-Mobile is to empower almost someone similar like a dictator that you trust with that pocket of your business, and should actually be the final say on whether or not that business goes in that direction or not. But always be self-aware that the dictator may actually be choosing the wrong decisions for that period of time. Hopefully that answers your question, but you have to be firmly grounded in your principles and what's important to you and what your objectives are. But then you also need to have something that should be enticing, and the value should be understood by everyone who's doing the adoption.
Thank you, Chris. And we have one more question for T-Mobile. What technologies is T-Mobile moving from in their DevOps toolchain?
Yeah, so if we're going to just refer to, I'm going to stay in the source control management and CI/CD space. Most enterprises, T-Mobile's not shy from this, but most enterprises started with, when they started with Git, they started with Bitbucket, or they started with some of their other sort of legacy Git tools. There has been a lot of Bitbucket within T-Mobile, and from a source control management tool, we obviously will now use GitLab for our source control management. From an orchestrator perspective, there was a lot of Jenkins, and Jenkins seems like the primary choice for all of the legacy fragmentation that exists everywhere. And from a Jenkins master perspective, I think we had in the hundreds. And that will primarily move to GitLab as well from a CI/CD perspective. The other parts of the tool chains, various industry leading tools that either, if GitLab is something where we can do a swap and it makes sense from a throughput perspective, we will. If it's not ready yet or not matured, or there's something better that meets the throughput objective, that's how we would make that decision.
Thank you, Chris. I think this one's for GitLab. What is the typical starting feature or functions you see with GitLab implementations? Pete?
So I think we would say that you see most customers will start with source code management and CI/CD, depending on where they were, where they're coming from. Being that we have a huge number of customers that started out on the open source side of the world with us, and wanting to be able to host and manage their own Git repositories. I think that's where we've seen a lot of customers begin their journey with GitLab, and then as they evolve in the maturity of using it and learning about the feature functionality, we see that expand out in through CI/CD. We're also seeing more and more people starting to look and adopt security as the fast follow, because they're seeing value in the fact that the earlier they can run those security scans and discover the vulnerabilities, the less expensive it is for them to remediate. And if they can remediate them quicker, then again, they're going to deliver better products faster. So
thank you, Pete. Another question for GitLab. How does GitLab work with existing DevOps tools?
So we have different integration points. We have some customers, for example, that love Jira, that are huge Jira shops. They use Jira super extensively. What we've done is we've built integrations so that instead of using GitLab necessarily for the issue tracking system, we integrate them so that they can work. So as you update and do things in Jira, it's reflective in GitLab. And so we've seen a lot there. We also see a lot as you start getting into the infrastructure as code, where people are starting to version control Terraform, for example, or CloudFormation templates. Or it's not a pure integration, but they're now all of a sudden applying software development lifecycle processes to it, versus just having a bunch of scripts sitting somewhere in the old days of system administration. And so we see integrations at that perspective on the other end as well. We've also seen customers who are still, it's going to be a while before they're ready to move off of Jenkins, and so they're using GitLab as the source code repository. So again, being an open core product, we make it very easy for anyone to do integrations or to contribute to it. So there are lots of things depending on where you are. Long term, we see companies like T-Mobile and others get the most value as they adopt more stages for us. But Chris is under a big task, right? He's at a very large organization trying to change a huge community of developers and changing their processes. And sometimes you can't always do that as a bigger bang. And so we want to be supportive of those customers as well. So it varies on a customer basis would probably be the short answer.
Got it. Thank you, Pete. We have one more for GitLab. What areas of DevOps does GitLab address?
So we address the full life cycle. We have the what we refer to as our stages, right? So we do things from as early as planning through the build and then automating the testing. But we try to cover all 10 stages of the life cycle. This is probably the first deck I've presented where we didn't use the infinity loop, because we do talk about that and being able to reflect back and seeing those changes and make it. We've added functionality all the way to observability now, so that we're able to pull those metrics back into your dev test life cycles.
Cool. One last question before we're top of the hour. For T-Mobile, what are ways of improving physiological safety with developer platforms?
Yeah, so psychological safety, I think, is so crucial for any enterprise to grow and foster experimentation, because you should feel safe to experiment. You should be safe to make judgment calls. If you've lost that capability within your enterprise, you're going in the wrong direction from an engineering perspective. I think one of the best ways to do that is you architect mechanisms to be able to experiment better. So if you've got a highly sensitive production system that every time you change it, it breaks, well, then you need to get better at essentially simulating that environment so that you can test it before it gets there, or you need to get better at your rollout. So from a canary perspective, if you can blue-green your incoming version and you've only touched and impacted 1 or 2 customers instead of millions of customers, well, then your blast radius for your mistake is much smaller, and then you don't continue with your rollout, right? So that's one of the mechanisms from a rollout perspective. What you can also do is you can make sure that some sort of standard is followed in terms of product architecture, so that things are architected to have minimal blast radius. If a backwards compatibility, for example, is one method that you would ensure that your old customers are still getting the same sort of API calls that they did before, and maybe opt-in, opt-out feature flags is another mechanism to make it so anyone who wants to try out sort of your new track or your latest track can be helpful as well. There's a bunch of different concepts and tools that you can help make things that were brittle and fragile before into highly repeatable, done all the time, and boring. So if I were to think about a theme that we took that correlates with this, we took a lot of very fragile processes and we made them very boring to do and done thousands of times. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Chris. With that, we'll be ending today's webinar. Thank you all for attending. Please remember to stay connected and complete the brief survey at the conclusion of the event. We look forward to supporting you in your current and future projects. Thank you again. Have a great day.